Starting chapter 4 today. Chapter 4 is just a continuation of more talking about triangles here. 4.1 and 4.2 kind of go together. Start 4.1, we're going to talk about identifying special segments in triangles. So there are 4 special segments we're going to talk about today. We should already know one of them, but then 3 more new ones that we'll talk about as well. So if you look here, here's the 4 special segments we're going to talk about: perpendicular bisector, angle bisector, median, and altitude. Let's just go one at a time and we'll see what these look like and what they do. So a perpendicular bisector, it's a line or a segment that passes through a midpoint of a side and is also perpendicular to that side. All right, so let's go ahead and draw in our triangle ABC and then draw a line or a segment that is perpendicular to BC that goes through the midpoint of BC. All right, so I have the midpoint of BC right here. Let's call it D. I know it's a midpoint because it makes those 2 segments equal. And I'm going to draw a segment that is perpendicular to that. And how do I know it's perpendicular? Because I'm going to make right angles here. So what does a perpendicular bisector give us? It gives us 2 things, actually. One, it gives us 2 right angles. And then 2, it gives us 2 congruent segments. The word perpendicular gives us the right angles, and the word bisector gives us the congruent segments. Next, we have an angle bisector. So this one we should already know. We did this one back in chapter 1. So an angle bisector is a segment that divides an angle into 2 congruent angles. So pick any angle. We're going to do A here. And do your best to draw a segment that cuts that angle in half. And I know it cuts it in half because I'm going to put arc marks in there showing they're congruent. So what does an angle bisector give us? 2 congruent angles. Next, we have a median. A median is a segment that goes from a vertex of a triangle to the midpoint of the opposite side. So let's pick a vertex. We're just going to pick A again and draw a segment that goes from A to the midpoint of the opposite side. So let's call this point D. We'll call that the midpoint. And I know it's midpoint because it makes those 2 segments equal. And then let's connect A to D. And AD is called a median. What does a median give us? It gives us 2 congruent segments. I just realized I forgot in the last one to put a letter there. We'll put that letter D on that point. And the last one is called an altitude. An altitude goes from a vertex that hits the opposite side perpendicularly. So start at A and draw a line so that it's perpendicular to BC. Do the best you can. It's not going to be perfect, but that looks pretty good. We'll call that point D. And it's perpendicular means it gives us right angles there. So what does an altitude give us? An altitude gives us 2 right angles. So all we're going to do today is just practice recognizing which of these 4 segments is present. So let's take a look at these 4. The first one, we see 2 things. We see a perpendicular symbol there, so right angles, and we see congruent segments. So which of the 4 gives us right angles and congruent segments? That would be the first one, a perpendicular bisector. So number 1 is a perpendicular bisector. Letter B. All we see this time are congruent segments. That's it. So which of our 4 only gives us congruent segments? That would be a median. So a median, because it comes from a vertex and goes to what this point would be a midpoint of a triangle. The third one gives us congruent angles only. You can see the congruent angle marks here. Okay, so this segment here is called, which one gives us congruent angles? An angle bisector. Again, that's the one that we learned back in chapter 1, so that one should be pretty obvious for us at this point. And the last one, it gives us congruent segments again, but only congruent segments. So once again, this one is called a median. All right, so you can see what we did there, just finding what we are given and naming which kind of segment gives us what we see. So here are 5 more problems. I'd like you to pause the video and come back and check when you are done. All right, it's going through the answers here. Letter E, it's perpendicular and bisector, so this is a perpendicular bisector. It has congruent segments and it has a right angle. Letter F has congruent angles, so this is called an angle bisector. Letter G, again, has right angle and congruent segments, so this is another perpendicular bisector. Letter H just has a congruent segment, so this one's called a median. And letter I only has the right angle, so that one is called an altitude. All right, number 2, given the information provided, tell what else must be true. So AO is an altitude. Remember, an altitude is perpendicular to the opposite side. So perpendicular means we must have 2 right angles. So name those right angles. Angle COA and angle EOA are right angles. As soon as you see altitude, you should be thinking we have right angles. Okay? Letter B, a median. A median will only give us congruent segments. So AO is a median. That means that these two are equal. So I know that CO is congruent to EO. Letter C, AO is an angle bisector. So that means that these two angles must be congruent. Angle CAO and angle EAO are congruent. I should put a congruent symbol in there instead of a comma. And finally, I'm supposed to say BO. Let me change that. BO is a perpendicular bisector. So that gives us 2 things. That gives us congruent segments. So I know CO is congruent to EO. But it also gives us right angles right here. So angle COB and angle EOB are right angles. All right, number 3, if DG is a median, what do we know? All right, so why don't we draw a triangle DEF? It doesn't have to be anything special, just draw a triangle DEF. And DG is a median. Well, you might be thinking G's not here. That's because G is a midpoint. So if it's coming from D, it must be going to EF. So draw in DG. And what do we know? Since it's a median, those 2 segments are congruent. So EG is congruent to FG. Number 4, if FB is an altitude. All right, so let's draw a triangle DEF again. Again, doesn't be any special, just draw DEF. FB is an altitude. So again, where's B at? I don't know, but it's coming from F. So therefore, it must be going to this line here, DE. Altitude means it gives us perpendicular lines there. It gives us right angles. So there's B right there. So what do we know? I know that angle DBF and angle EBF are right angles. Number 5, EJ is an angle bisector. So again, let's draw DEF here. And EJ, well, it's coming from E, and it must be going this way, away from E. So that must be J right there. An angle bisector means these 2 are congruent. So angle DEJ is congruent to angle FEJ. All right, finally, AT is a perpendicular bisector. All right, so let's draw DEF one last time. T is on EF. So T should be the midpoint of EF here, making those 2 equal. A should be somewhere up here, making this perpendicular here. So what do we know? We know 2 things. We know ET is congruent to FT, and we also know angle ETA and angle FTA are right angles. And that will be it for section 4.1. Hopefully you learned a lot about our 4 special segments in triangles.